We are currently involved in a study of Paul's reference, a threefold reference in 1 Corinthians 15:29 and following to his suffering. It is absolutely impossible to be a good Bible student and to ignore the significance of Paul's reference to his suffering. Because Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 9, I think that God has set forth us, the apostles, last of all as men destined to die. Now, again, it is impossible to overemphasize the significance of that. We know that thousands, perhaps millions of Christians have died in martyrdom since that time, yet for Paul, there was something distinct, something special, something exclusive, something limited to the suffering of that generation and to the suffering of the apostles and prophets. That distinctiveness was iterated by Jesus in Matthew 23 and Luke 11:49 and following, in that Jesus said that Israel would fill up the measure of her sin, extending all the way back, of persecuting God's prophets, and now the apostles and prophets that he would send to her. They would, in that generation, fill up the measure of their sin. And remember, Paul said the apostles are the last of all to die. Now, this theme of suffering, martyrdom, filling the measure of sin, and the parousia is part of the very warp and woof of the Old Testament as well as the New. In the New Testament, it becomes even more graphic, more urgent. And while I could expand on this over and over and over again, let me remind you, my little book, In Flaming Fire, I forgot to mention this in my last session. This is an exegetical and a hermeneutical study of 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, where Paul wrote to living, breathing human beings being persecuted by the Jews, who in that persecution were filling up the measure of their sin, and judgment was going to come on them imminently. And here's Paul writing to the Thessalonians, being persecuted, saying that they, not some unknown church in some unknown generation, but they would receive relief from that persecution, quote, when the Lord Jesus is revealed from heaven. Folks, if the Lord did not come, and that's the resurrection, if the Lord did not come in the lifetime of the Thessalonians, i.e. in Paul's generation as an apostle, among whom he was the last to die, then Paul's prediction failed. It's that simple. Go to my website, eschatology.org or bibleprophecy.com, and order a copy of the book In Flaming Fire. Did you know this book is actually being used as a classroom book on hermeneutic? That's how it's being viewed. Well, anyway, now then, what about Revelation? In my book, Who is This Babylon? I outline this extensively, but I could only do this ever so briefly. I want you to notice in Matthew, Jesus accused Old Covenant Israel in Jerusalem of killing the Old Testament prophets. Matthew chapter 23, 29 and following. It was to be Old Covenant Jerusalem that would kill him. He taught that in his parables, Matthew 21 and 22. And, as just noted, he said it would be Jerusalem that would kill his apostles and prophets, and in doing so, they would fill up the measure of their sin, and judgment would come upon them in that generation. Now watch this. Paul, writing to the Thessalonians, reminded them that they were being persecuted by their countrymen, which included the Jews, Acts chapter 17. The Jews were the movers and the shakers of the Thessalonian persecution. And Paul said that the Jews had killed the prophets, they've killed Jesus, they were killing the apostles and prophets of Jesus, they were filling up the measure of their sin, and judgment was about to fall. This is a perfect mirror echo of Matthew chapter 23. But now watch this. In Revelation, what do we find? We find that Babylon is the city that killed the prophets. Revelation 16:6 and following. By the way, the term the prophets, when used without a contextual qualifier, invariably refers to Old Covenant prophets. And you know what? Rome never killed an Old Covenant prophet. The Roman Catholic Church never killed an Old Covenant prophet. There's only one city that was guilty of killing the Old Covenant prophets. Guess what? That was Old Covenant Jerusalem. So here is Babylon killing the Old Covenant prophets. It is, quote, where the Lord was slain, Revelation chapter 11, verse 8. And it is also the city, catch the power of this, guilty of killing the apostles and the prophets of Jesus. Oh, and the cup of Babylon, her cup, which contained the blood of the saints, was now full. And guess what? Jesus was about to come in judgment, i.e. the time of the resurrection, in the destruction of Babylon. We thus have absolute, perfect parallel and correlation between Jesus. Old Covenant Jerusalem killed the prophets. They would kill her. They would kill his apostles and prophets. They would fill up the measure of their sin, be destroyed at his coming in that generation. We have Paul, perfect correlation. Old Covenant Jerusalem killed the prophets, killed Jesus, killing the apostles and prophets of Jesus, filling up the measure of her sin. Judgment was about to fall. And it would be in the lifetime of the Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians chapter 1. We have Revelation now, and we have Babylon, which killed the prophets. It is where the Lord was slain. She was killing the apostles and prophets of Jesus. Her cup was full, and Jesus was about to come at the resurrection. That's the resurrection coming of 1 Corinthians 15, which would vindicate the suffering of Paul of 1 Corinthians 15, 29 through 31. Let me say again, unless you can divorce Paul's references to his suffering in 1 Corinthians 15, 29 and following from the sufferings of Christ, unless you can divorce it from his statement that the apostles had been set forth last of all as men destined to die, and unless you can divorce that from the filling up of the measure of Israel's sin, the filling up of the measure of the suffering of the martyrs, and go read Revelation 6, 9 to 11. Folks, unless you can divorce all of these passages from one another clearly and explicitly and undeniably, it means that the sufferings of Christ that Paul mentioned in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, 29 and following, has to be put within the context of the imminent coming of the Lord for the resurrection, because Revelation chapter 11, at the fall of the city where the Lord was slain, the city guilty of killing the prophets, guess what? It is the time of the dead that they should be judged and rewarded. Revelation 11, 15 and following. Folks, you just can't divorce 1 Corinthians 15 and Paul's reference to his suffering as an apostle for what Revelation says about the time of the judgment, the time of the resurrection, the time of the vindication of the martyrs. That would take place at the coming of the Lord. Oh, at the end of the millennium. And it was at hand. Just like Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15, 51. Brethren, I tell you a mystery. Not all of us will sleep. Perfect correlation. Get my book, Who is This Babylon?, in which I outline in short form every one of these constituent elements and a whole lot more, demonstrating without any doubt whatsoever that the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15 has to be set within the context of the avenging of the apostles and the prophets, and that took place just as Jesus said, this generation will not pass away until all of these things have been fulfilled. Okay, there's so much more I could talk about on this subject, so we'll see you on the flip side.